I bought this dresser for $30. It's one of those dressers you see everywhere. You might even own one. But what if this could look like it's always belonged in an old apothecary shop? Well, today I'm giving this ordinary dresser new life with a two-tone aged finish, and I'll show you how. All right, so here's where we're starting. The shape is good, but this finish is tired and this top has a lot of wear and damage. I already know I want a stained wood top on this piece, so I'm going to sand all the way back to bare wood. And then there's the base. It's got this scrolled, sort of dated detail on it. At first, I thought about cutting it off completely and building a new one, but instead, I'm going to build it out and change the profile. The biggest transformation is going to be on these drawers, so let's get going on them. First, I removed all the hardware and gave everything a really good clean. I used TSP Alternative to cut through all that grime and buildup. You really don't want to sand this into the surface or trap it into your finish because it's going to cause adhesion issues later on. The seller told me this dresser had belonged to her mother, who'd kept some of the damaged wood and veneer pieces in an envelope. Well, when I was removing the drawers, I noticed one of the drawer tracks was broken, and sure enough, that envelope had the missing piece. With that repair done, I started filling the old hardware holes. Mixed up some Bondo and applied it so it could start setting up while I worked on the rest of the piece. I knew this top was going to take some time to get down to the bare wood, so I got right to sanding with 120 grit sanding mesh. But pretty quickly, I realized this finish was not coming off easily at all. I checked the back, and sure enough, it was veneer. Decent thickness, but veneer nonetheless, so I knew I had to be careful. Instead of fighting with the sandpaper, I grabbed my carbide scraper. And that actually made a huge difference getting through the old finish without burning through the veneer. I paused working on the top to go back to the drawer fronts and scrape the Bondo back before it could fully harden. Then I went over the holes again with wood filler just to smooth everything out. And while that dried, I headed right back to the top. Because the carbide scraper had done most of the heavy lifting, it didn't take me too long to sand the rest of the finish back with that same 120 grit mesh sandpaper. For the trim around the edges, I switched to a different scraper and used a few different blades to get into all those grooves and curves. Then I went back in with my orbital sander, this time using a foam backing pad and 180 grit sandpaper. After that, I used a shaped sanding block to finish off the trim and also hand sanded the entire top with 180 grit. And finally, I scuff sanded the body of the dresser so the new finish would have something to grip onto. Because this piece would be getting an old, aged world look, I also sanded a little deeper on some of the edges and the corners. And that's so that the real wood will show through once I distress the paint finish. Before touching the drawers, I practiced using my router on some scrap wood. I switched the router to a 1/4 inch V-bit, tested the depth, and made adjustments until I was happy with the look. This step is important. You really only need one router pass, so getting the depth right ahead of time matters. When I went freehand, it went a little bit all over the place, so I made sure to clamp down a guide, then ran it through again, and I was pretty happy with where I was at. To lay out the lines on the drawer front, I measured each drawer into thirds, making sure everything lined up with the existing routed drawers that were already on the piece. Taking the extra time here helps the finished drawers feel intentional and consistent, not like some sort of decorative afterthought. I clamped a straight piece of scrap wood directly onto each drawer to act as a guide for the router. This keeps the lines straight and prevents slipping, especially when you're working on multiple drawers. After it was clamped in place, I measured everything again to make sure it was perfectly straight. I then routed my 2 lines per drawer, using the guide for each pass. And I repeated this process across all 4 drawers. Just a single controlled pass for each line, slow and steady. Once the lines were all routed on all 4 of the drawers, I sanded the drawer faces to remove any excess filler and to smooth out those routed edges. This final step softens the lines just enough and gets everything ready for the next stage of the finish. After sanding, I wiped everything down with water to remove the dust. I also taped off any areas that I didn't want to get paint on. Then, before any paint went on, I sealed the surface with a coat of clear shellac. Shellac provides a clean base to work on, and it makes sure that the surface is protected when you distress later on. Then I got working on the base. I unscrewed that scrolled apron board from the front. And once it was off, reattached the structural pieces. The depth of the board was 4 inches, so I headed to the hardware store and looked for something that would be not too crazy expensive and the right size. This hit the mark. If you're not familiar, lumber measurements are a little unusual. 1 by 5 is actually 3/4 of an inch by 4, so this was actually the perfect size. I cut everything on the miter saw. Haven't cut a lot of angles, and for some reason, they just don't make sense in my head all the time. So I cut the first side piece, and then I cut the second side piece, and they were different lengths. But fortunately, I was able to cut a little bit off the end, and that made it perfect. And then I attached them with clamps and then measured to see what the width across the front needed to be. And then dry fit everything to check to make sure it was a perfect fit. Before I attach the base, I am going to paint this piece, and I'm using milk paint. It's called Little Black Dress by Fusion Mineral. So I'm just doing a very quick sand of that shellac primer that I put on and then wiping back all the dust again. And then I'm going to get this paint mixed up and ready to go. Now, the reason I'm using milk paint is because I'm planning on distressing this dresser, as you know, and that's why I did the shellac underneath. So I mixed it up, equal parts water to paint, stirred it up for a couple of minutes. I'm using a foam brush here and going around all of the edges quickly and then just rolling everything on. And then doing a quick roll over everything one more time to get a smooth surface and even finish. This milk paint really doesn't take very long to dry at all, so I did 2 coats and then got to work on attaching the base. I attached the front apron piece first, using Gorilla Glue here and spreading it around a little bit with my foam brush. And then once it was on, I checked just to make sure that the drawers were going to fit okay. And then I attached it from underneath using that structural wood piece and reattached the center brace. Then I flipped it over onto its top and grabbed some of these brackets or braces to make sure that it was secured really, really well. I repeated the process of the Gorilla Glue to attach the pieces onto the side and clamped them in place, and then used some really long wood screws to drill all the way through the existing dresser base through to the newly attached base that I had built. So once everything was attached, even though I had dry fit it all, there was still a little bit of a gap on the corners, but no worries, I just added some wood filler and I can sand that off later. Once the filler and the glue had all dried, I sanded everything back smooth and then blended the corners kind of around the seams to make it look like it was one solid piece instead of separate boards. Then I moved on to one of my favorite parts, distressing. I used wet sanding to wear the finish back in just the right places, focusing on edges, corners, and any area that would be high touch. Wet sanding gives you more control and creates a softer, time-worn look. Less is usually more when it comes to distressing, but if you take a little bit too much off, it's not a big deal. I just went back and added a bit more paint, and then let it sit for a bit while I finished the distressing on the rest of the piece. Then I came back to the drawer with just a wet rag this time and wiped back a little bit on the edges. Another distressing tip is to lean in to some of the blemishes and marks on your piece. I pulled off all the tape and gave the top a wipe down with acetone. That cleared away any remaining dust and residue, and it also shows you exactly how the wood's going to look with a clear finish. And it makes scratches and swirl marks jump out. Sure enough, I spotted a scratch I hadn't noticed before. So I went back with my orbital sander and a bit of hand sanding to take it out. I then added a pre-stain conditioner, and finally, I was ready to add my dark, rich Kona stain. I applied a coat to the top, let it sit for about 5 minutes, and then wiped it back, and decided that it wasn't quite dark enough, so I then applied a second coat. The base got the same treatment, the pre-stain conditioner, followed by a coat of the Kona stain, and I was pretty happy with how that looked. I did find, though, along the top of the base, it didn't take the stain quite as well, so I decided to do a second coat just on those areas and then wiped it back as well. This was the moment that really made it feel like an apothecary piece, the hardware. With what looks like 24 small drawers, the pulls really matter. I tried a few options, ruled one out for quality, and in the end chose to keep the same hardware across all the drawers. With the hardware selected, I moved on to top coating the base and the drawers. Ideally, I would have done everything at once, but I wanted to keep things moving, so I applied the stain and finishing oil just to those parts first. Breaking the top coat into stages lets you keep working without having to stop and wait for everything to dry. I also did a few quick touch-ups on the base with Blend-All sticks and a pencil crayon to blend in spots where the glue hadn't fully sanded away. Before drilling anything, I made simple templates for each drawer size. I marked the center and hole spacing once so every drawer would be consistent. Templates save a lot of time and help keep everything aligned across a layout like this. I use my punch so I know where I'm going to drill the holes. Pre-drilling also keeps the holes clean and helps prevent chipping or splitting. The next day, once everything had had time to dry, I came back to finish things up. I applied a natural stain and finishing oil to the stained areas as the final top coat and let that sit for about 5 minutes before wiping it back. I laid out all the hardware, magnetized my drill bit, and started to screw everything into the pre-drilled holes. I just started them first and then finished screwing them all in a bit of an assembly line. I got the dressers set up in my staging area and then put the drawers back in. Notice anything wrong here? Thank goodness all I did was screw it in upside down. The holes were at least in the right spot. Let's take a quick look back at where we started. A basic, everyday dresser with a dated, worn-out finish. And here it is now. The same dresser transformed into an aged apothecary-style piece with a warm two-tone finish that looks like it always belonged this way. Thank you so much for watching. Check the description for all the products I used in this video. And if this kind of real hands-on makeover helps you, I'd love it if you let me know in the comments and consider subscribing for more.